Joining me now from New York City is Brian Chen. He's Chief Strategy Officer at the Chinese American Planning Council. Good to have you on the show.
It's great to be here with you tonight.
So this uptick we're seeing in anti-Asian hate incidents, how much of it is driven by the pandemic?
Well, I would say that there is a significant portion of it that's driven by the trauma and the effects of the global health pandemic and everything associated with it. But I think it's important to remember that while all of the increase in anti-Asian hate is alarming, it's not necessarily new. And bias and violence against the Asian American community in the United States has really been intertwined with our collective immigration story from the 1800s with the Page Act and the prohibition of immigrant Chinese women into the United States, to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then, if you remember, during World War II, the Japanese internment camps, which were used to inter Japanese Americans, and more recently, the effects of Islamophobia after 9/11 and the Muslim travel ban by the previous federal administration, that all of this has obviously been intertwined with our history. And so while there is merit to attributing the increase and the rise in attacks to the global health pandemic, I think it's only been exacerbated by the by the rhetoric of the previous administration, calling this the China virus, calling this the Kung flu, and we're seeing all of that snowball now. I think the silver lining in all of this is that because there's more of an active voice in the community, and because folks are starting to feel empowered in the community to report, that we're seeing more of the spotlight from the media, from community groups, and other activists on this particular issue, which will hopefully push both the federal government and then localities to really act on this.
So much to unpack there. But when you talk about this spotlight, has the increasing awareness, I wonder, made things better or worse for the community?
So a general awareness of most things, I think, in the long term is a positive. And, I think to the previous segment that was just aired, there has been this suppression of voice, whether it's put your head down and, kind of do what you need to do to get by and don't cause a nuisance. Well, that sort of mentality is something that's really hitting an inflection point right now. And what the Asian American community is looking to do is say, hey, we're important, we're here, we're just as much of the fabric of American society as anybody else, and we're hurting right now. And because we're hurting, we ultimately need support. And we'll definitely need support from the government, but we'll also need to be able to support each other as a community and in solidarity with other communities, specifically communities of color.
All right, Brian, the hate incidents are not just physical and verbal attacks, because, those we see and read a lot in the media because they're easy to sensationalize, but there's also shunning, right, and avoidance, almost a silent hate. How does the country address that?
Well, part of it is education, and I think a lot of it comes down to education and understanding the stereotypes and the plight and the challenges that us as an Asian American community have faced ever since we've come into this country. And so I think one way to go about addressing that is really understanding that there are many activist groups that are out there now pushing for Asian American studies and education in the public school system. We see that more on the higher education level, but trying to integrate that and make it a point of emphasis as early as kindergarten, I think will go a long way to really understanding the true Asian American experience, and hopefully other communities, Black, brown, and white, will start to empathize with our successes, but also the challenges and the struggle a little bit more.
It's interesting you should bring up stereotypes, because I keep thinking, Asian Americans have often been painted as the model minority. In fact, new data continue to show that the community as a whole have a higher socioeconomic level, household income compared with the rest of the U.S. Could this be one of the reasons why AAPI communities become a target?
Well, what I'll say about the household income number is that that's a little bit misleading, because it is also known that Asian Americans and Asians in general have the highest number of family members within the household. So while we may have higher household collective income numbers, you're talking about income that's generated by multiple individuals living in a single unit. So it is a little bit misleading. I think the other notion that you brought up around Asian Americans as a monolith is also something that really needs to be addressed and dispelled, because again, it's the Asian Americans in general are a very diverse diaspora, from various ethnic backgrounds and linguistic and other sorts of backgrounds as well. And so understanding that the needs of one community, for instance, the East Asian community, may be totally different from the needs of another Asian community. For instance, the South Asian community, I think, are important to understand and contextualize. And that's part of the reason why organizations like mine, the Chinese American Planning Council, as well as other advocates, are really pushing local governments as well as the federal government to really focus on disaggregated data for Asian communities, so we really understand the true depth of the issues that we face, and then are better addressed, are better suited to be able to address those issues, whether it's through funding, through policy, through education, and so on and so forth.
Crucial distinction indeed. Lastly, because you bring up legislation, last month the Senate passed the bill to counter hate crimes against Asian Americans, set to be voted on in the House of Representatives. How do you see this bill making things better?
Well, this is pretty unprecedented in any kind in terms of having this conversation take the center stage on the federal level. What it'll do short term will obviously, if it passes the House and then it's signed by the president, provide culturally and linguistically appropriate resources to both federal, state, and local justice officials to ensure that we're monitoring the increase in crime against the Asian American community a little bit better. It'll also help with making sure that there's a priority in public education to make sure that there's awareness building in culturally and linguistically appropriate languages. There's better data collection. And so this is a good first step, but ultimately at the end of the day, there's only so much that the federal government can do. It's now incumbent on localities, cities, and states to ensure that they're also taking this guidance and really taking steps towards making actions, whether it's, again, on the funding side, on the policy side, on a much more local level to address the anti-Asian violence and bias that's happening, because again, it's spread out throughout the country. It's not just confined to New York City. It's not just confined to the West Coast and San Francisco and LA, that we're seeing this across the entire country. So it's a good first step in terms of getting that general, uniform, and baseline guidance out. But again, localities, states, cities really have to do more to take that and really ensure that they're taking action on a much more hyper-local level.
Brian Chen, we thank you so much for your insight on this important topic. Thank you.